Hey folks, John here, Old Hickory Forge. Welcome back. As you can see, I got my buddy Eric down from New York. If you've been around the channel, you've probably seen me and him get together a few times, and we tend to do some pretty cool stuff. So, if you watched our Dane Axe video where we made the two Dane Axes up at Eric's shop in Camillus, New York, he doesn't have a 2x72. We had to do a lot of grinding, you know, by hand or with a bench grinder or with a 1x30. If you want to seriously get into knife making, blacksmithing, that sort of thing, eventually you are going to need a 2x72. So what we're doing this weekend is we're building him one. I've built a few of these, and I've kind of got a process down for it. So I've taken the liberty of putting together a blueprint and a parts list. Here's the blueprint. And here's the parts list. If you can't read my handwriting, I'll read it off later in the video, towards the end. I kind of made this when I was in a hurry, so it might not be totally accurate, so stick around and we'll see what we can come up with. So to get started making the base plate of the grinder, what we had here was a 6-inch wide by 24-inch long piece of 3/16 inch plate. We've gone ahead and cut off 6 inches from the end. This is going to become the motor mount later, and this is going to be the base plate for the grinder. So Eric's gone through with the Evo saw and cut out all the pieces for the frame of the grinder. Well, out of our 2-inch square tubing, we got 2 pieces that are 7.5 inches long. We got 1 piece that's 8 inches and 1 piece that's 8.5. Your 8-inch piece is going to be your tracking arm mount, so just go ahead and set it to the side for now. We're going to deal with that later. All we got to do now is go through, bevel all these edges, get everything cleaned up, situate it where it needs to go, and start welding this baby together. So, Eric's gone through and got the uprights welded on. Now we need to weld on the tool arm mount, is what I'm going to call it. First thing we got to do is drill and tap a hole where we're going to put the bolt that's going to put the tension on the tool arm, you know, kind of like this piece right here. So we'll just drill and tap a hole to accommodate a piece of 1/2-inch number 13 all thread, and we'll keep moving on this thing. So we got the hole for the tool arm mount drilled and tapped, getting ready to be welded onto the uprights. Quick note, whenever you do all this welding, this piece that you're going to be using to tension your tool arm, go ahead and put that in there to keep spatter out of the threads, just for good measure. And we'll get that guy welded on and keep moving. So now it's time to build the tracking arm mount, and this is where it gets kind of complicated. So what we've done is we marked out 1 inch from the end, 1 inch from the side, and we've drilled a 1/2-inch hole. And I've gone through, marked 3 inches from each end, drilled a 3/8 inch hole. And then what we're going to do is go through with a grinder and cut a channel down to the holes, and then go through with a jigsaw with a metal blade and cut out that piece. And that's going to be where our tracking arm is going to sit. So what we got here is what's going to be our tracking arm. This is a piece of 1.5 inch square tubing cut off at 13 inches. 1/2-inch hole drilled 7.5 inches from this end. And this is the piece we just cut. This needs to fit down in there. And as you can see, it does not. So what we got to do is chuck this baby up in the vise and go in here with a file and flatten all this out, smooth it up real good until our tracking arm sits down in there real nice. It's slow going, but we can make it happen. So we got enough material to remove to where now the tracking arm pivots freely. So that's what we were after, and we can keep moving on this thing. So oftentimes when you get your hands on this 2-inch square tubing, there's a seam on the inside that will actually prevent your 1.5 inch square tubing from sliding into it like you want. So what I'm doing is just going at it with a dull wood chisel and a hammer and kind of breaking it free. See what I mean? About we chiseled that whole seam out of there. So here we are after getting the tracking arm mount welded on, and it's starting to look like something. So now it's time to get the D plate mounted to what's going to be the tool arm. So we got 2 center punch marks here and there. We're going to put a 1/2-inch hole there. We're going to put a 1/4-inch hole there. And then we'll just bolt this thing to it. Quick note, we got the D plate assembly and the wheel kit from Oregon Blade Maker on eBay. There's a link in the description. If you're just starting out and you're looking to build your own 2x72, you really can't beat the value for them. So we'll get moving on that. So we got the D plate bolted onto the tool arm. It slides in and out freely, loosening and tightening the thing we put on over here. Important note, in between the tool arm, the platen arm, and the D plate, we have put a 1/4-inch spacer with the same holes drilled in it. The reason for that is if you put this thing in here with the D plate bolted directly to the tool arm, your wheels are going to be sitting right here, and your belt is going to be tracking very, very close to the frame of the grinder. And if it tracks too far to the right, it can cut into the frame of the grinder, which, you know, it's just not good. So it's a good idea to put a 1/4 inch spacer in between the Platen arm and the D plate itself. But it's coming along, so we'll keep rocking and rolling. So with the Oregon Blademaker wheel kit, you get your 2 Platen wheels, you get a bolt that acts as the axle, you get 2 plastic spacers, and you get a washer. What you want to do, go ahead and put your washer on, put your wheel on, and then put your 2 plastic spacers on this end, you know, and that's really all there is to it. And then you just bolt that to it. And once you get it all the way threaded through, you got a nut, you add it on this side, and you got your Platen wheels. I'm just explaining it because when I first learned how to do this, there really wasn't a good video on how to do it, and I always kind of wanted there to be, so that's about all there is to it. Also, quick note, these wheels should be able to spin freely. You don't want to over tighten them, but there should also be 0 side-to-side play in them. So you have to kind of find that happy medium between tightening them down without stiffening them up. About right there is pretty good. So now it's time to start making the Platen assembly for the grinder. So what we got here is just a piece of 2-inch angle iron. What we got here are 2 pieces of 1/4 inch by 3/4 inch wide flat bar with a 1/4 inch hole drilled 1 inch from each end. Bolts to the D plate just like that. And then basically we're just gonna weld the angle iron to it so that it sits level with the wheels and everything. Also, if you bolted a bigger piece of angle iron directly to the D plate, it's gonna be sitting off to the side of your wheels. Here it's gonna be sitting flush with the side of the wheels, and it just makes it run a little better. So to get our Platen set where it needs to go, we're using a framing level. We're not actually using the bubbles on the level or anything. We're just kind of using it as a straight edge to make sure the wheels line up with the front of the Platen. We've got a little spacer put down here to hold it up, and we've got it clamped up here. So we're just going to go ahead and get it tacked onto these pieces of flat bar, and then we'll take it off of the grinder to do the full structural welds, just to avoid, you know, doing any welding near the plastic wheels. But it's coming together. So what we got here, we're getting started on the tracking wheel assembly. We got a piece of 1.5 inch square bar cut off at 3 inches. We got a piece of 2-inch square cut off at 2 inches. We've gone through and cut off one of the sides. So it basically just slides over it like that. What we're gonna do, clamp all this together and drill us a 1/4 inch hole, about 3/4 inches from the top and centered, and that'll give this thing plenty of room to pivot. It's hard to explain exactly how all this is gonna come together, but once you see it, you'll get it. So we've gone ahead and drilled the 1/4 inch hole through both pieces while they were clamped together, so that hole's going to line up real nice. And what we've done with our 1.5 inch square piece is we've turned it 90 degrees, and we've gone ahead and drilled the hole that's going to accommodate our 1/2 inch number 13 tap. So the hole's just slightly smaller than a 1/2 inch. It's the bit that comes with the tap when you buy it. So we're just going to go through, cut some threads onto that, and that's what's going to serve. It's kind of hard to explain, but once it comes together, you'll see. Quick note: whenever you're cutting these threads onto what's going to be your tracking arm mount, the threads need to go all the way through. So after you get through your first side, just keep turning the tap until you get to the bottom, and just keep cutting through it. So we're getting to work making the tracking wheel assembly. What we got here, we've gone ahead and made the handle. This is just a piece of all thread with a piece of round stock welded onto the end. This is the hole we drilled and tapped earlier. Important note, this corner on the inside of where this thing is going to sit has to be knocked off. Otherwise, this thing won't pivot back and forth, because when you try to push on it from the bottom, it's going to be hitting right there and it's not going to move. Now, it has just a little bit of space to pivot, though, and that's what's going to allow you to move your tracking wheel left to right. So just make sure you do that. So here's the tracking wheel assembly put together. We basically just drilled and tapped the same 1/2 inch by 13 thread count hole that we've been using this whole time. That's where the tracking wheel is going to sit. Obviously this bolt's too long, we're going to need to trim it down, but that's not a big deal. So next step is to get this guy welded onto the frame of the grinder. Quick note, whenever you're welding on this tracking wheel assembly, it's very, very important that it be straight and square and true. So a good idea is just to go ahead and run some tacks on all 4 sides, because if you go in for a full weld on one side, the heat can actually pull the whole thing that way and it might throw it offline. So just tack all 4 sides before you go in for your main welds. So we got the tracking wheel assembly welded on. This is just kind of a proof of concept of how it works. See how it kind of pivots. All right, so what we're doing here, we're just using the framing level to make sure the wheels line up. We're not actually using the bubbles or anything. Basically what we're doing is we're just lining it up on the wheels and making sure we can't see any space. And you can see how this is where our tracking wheel needs to be braced. So we're just going to fill up that space in between the mount and the wheel itself with washers so the tracking wheel fits nice and snug. And it should run real nice and true. So we ended up using 3 1/8-inch washers to go in between the tracking wheel and the mount itself. But it sits nice and true. There's no space in between either of the wheels. It all lines up real good. Same principles as with the other wheels. It should be able to spin freely, but should have no side-to-side play. So, next thing we gotta do is get the motor mounted on this baby. So, now it's time to get started mounting the motor. So what we did was that 6-inch offcut from the original plate that we made the base plate out of has now been drilled and bolted to the motor itself. Over here we got the motor mount, which is tacked to the base plate of the grinder. It's flush with this end, 3.5 inches from the back of the last upright. Don't worry about all this excess material because the motor is going to have to sit kind of off to the side to make the drive wheel line up with the other wheels. So once we get it mounted, we'll worry about cutting off the excess. But that's what's going on now. Quick note while I'm thinking about it, the whole tracking wheel assembly does need to be upright like this. You can't just put the pivot on the end of this arm here, because then instead of your tracking wheel pivoting like that, it's going to be pivoting kind of like that, and it's going to make it impossible to track your belt straight. I'm only saying that because the same thing happened to me the first time I built one of these, and I want to save you guys the trouble. So, what we're doing now is we're wiring the motor. We got a 1 horsepower farm duty Harbor Freight motor. You want to get the farm duty because it's fully enclosed. There's no vents on the outside that metal dust can get into. It's just going to last longer. And what you're going to need to wire it is a 15 amp replacement shop cord. Now, in the 15 amp shop cord, you got 3 wires. You got a green wire and you got 2 lead wires. Green wire goes to the ground nut right there. And over here, you got a chart explaining what needs to be wired to what to make it turn a certain direction. So to go clockwise, we got the wires labeled P2, T3, and T5 wired together, secured with a wired nut. And then we got one of our lead wires connected to T2, T4, and T8, secured with a wired nut. And we got the other lead wire connected to P1, secured with a wire nut. So that's just kind of the short, sweet, and to the point on how to wire one of these motors to make it go the way you want it to go. So Eric's wiring his motor to a switch, which is something I didn't do on my grinder. It just comes on when I plug it in. I'm going to be building a new one pretty soon, so I'm not worried about it. But, you know, you can just have it where it comes on when you plug it in, and that works fine. But if you want to wire it to a switch, go ahead. So right now the motor is just sitting on the mount. It's not actually welded on yet, so we can move it back and forth if we need to. And what we're doing is we're checking with our framing level, just like we did before, not using the bubbles, just making sure, you know, we can't see space in between the wheels. So that one's got to line up. That one's got to line up, it does. And the tracking wheel needs to line up. And it's all looking pretty good, so we're going to run a couple of tacks. And then we'll take the motor off and actually weld the base plate to it. And we'll keep moving on this thing. It's starting to look like a grinder, though. So, here we are after getting the motor mount welded on. We've gone ahead and cut off the excess. We've also gone through with a cordless drill and drilled some holes in the corners of the base plate to make it easier to mount to a work table. Well, you could do that before you assemble the frame of the grinder. We just forgot. So next thing we got to do is we got to drill a 1/4 inch hole 1.5 inches up from the bottom of the tracking arm mount. That's going to connect the spring to this hole right here and the end of the tracking arm itself. And that's what's going to provide the tension for our belt. So we got the frame of the grinder disassembled, took the motor and the wheels off. Now Eric's just going through painting it black. So that's all there is to it. Get the tool arm put back in. And here we are getting the motor bolted back to the base plate. So now we're just putting the spring on. You just hook it in both of those holes. You have to kind of muscle it a little bit, but it'll go. So we got the spring in. That's how we get our tension on our tracking arm. If you want to, you can put a handle up here or something like that to make it a little more user-friendly, but I mean, just pushing on it works fine. So disregard what I said earlier about how to wire the motor. We wired it to go clockwise, and now the belt's turning backwards, so wire it to go counterclockwise. Just follow the chart and you'll be okay. All right, so now we got the motor turning the right way. The belt's running nice and true. Eric's just kind of playing with the tracking right now. Tracking to the left, tracking to the right. Here's Eric just testing it out with some scrap steel. All right, so here's the grinder all finished up. You know, obviously it's not as high quality as a $3,000 or $4,000 machine, but if you're just getting into knife making and you want to kind of build one as you can afford it, this is a good way to go. I think all in all, Eric's got about $400 in this build. You could go cheaper if you went with a recycled motor, you know, steel from the scrapyard, stuff like that. We bought everything new. The wheel kit was like $120. The motor was like $140 with a coupon, and we spent like another $100 on steel, and maybe another $30 or $40 on like the nuts and bolts and fittings and the switch to bring it all together. But it's a good, you know, fully serviceable machine. You could expand upon it, put a bigger motor, bigger drive wheel to get more power. You could use a hydraulic for your tension or something like that. But, you know, if you're just getting into knife making, something like that, you need a 2x72. This is a good jumping off point. What we're going to do now, like I said at the start of the video, last time I built one of these and I made a parts list, I was kind of in a hurry, so it wasn't totally accurate. But we've gone through and revised it, and we've recorded every single piece and part you need to assemble this grinder. So we're just going to go over the parts list real quick. So, you're going to need 6 inches wide by 24 inches long of 3/16 inch plate. That's to make your base plate and your motor mount. Your 1 horsepower farm duty Harbor Freight motor. You got that right there. 15 amp replacement cord with switch kit. The switch kit is technically optional, but it is really nice to have. The Oregon Blade Maker wheel kit. 48 inches, 4 feet of 2 inch by 2 inch 1/4 inch walled square tubing to build the frame of the grinder. 36 inches of 1.5 inch 3/16 inch walled square tubing to build your tool arm and your tracking arm. 8 inches of 1/4 inch by 3/4 inch flat bar. That's to make your platen spacers. 8.25 inches of 3/16 inch walled 2 inch angle iron. You could go 1/4 inch if you wanted to, but I really wouldn't go thinner than 3/16 inch because pushing on it will make it bend over time. 6 inches of 1/2 inch round stock. That's to make your handles. 6 inches of number 13 by 1/2 inch all thread to make this and that. 1/4 inch by 20 by 2.5 inch bolts with nuts and washers. Anytime I say bolts, just assume they need to come with nuts and washers. So 1/4 inch by 20 by 2.5 inch bolts with nuts and washers, 2 of them. 1/4 inch by 20 by 1 inch nuts, bolts, washers, 4 of them. That's to put your motor mount on, or mount your motor to the motor mount, and to put your platen on. Let's see, 1/2 inch by 13 by 3 inch nuts, bolts, washers, 2 of them. That's to put your D plate on and to act as the axle for your tracking wheel. 1/2 inch by 13 by 3.5 inch bolt with a nut and washer. That's what it goes right there. 1/2 inch washers, 4 of them. That's what uses the spacers for the tracking wheel. And 3.5 by 3/4 inch spring. That's what gives you your tension. Boom, good to go. So here's just a still of the parts list if you want to pause it and screenshot it. Sorry if you can't read my handwriting. So, what's good about a machine like this is you can kind of build it as you can afford it. You know, you can buy little pieces and parts here and there until you can assemble a grinder. Drawback, you don't have any kind of variable speed. It's the drive wheel is directly on the motor. You've only got 1 speed to work with, which really isn't that big a deal if you ask me. Good thing, you can change out this tool arm for different size contact wheels if you need to. You know, lower end, you know, starter grinders from like Shop, Fox, and Grizzly, you can't change out your platen attachments at all. So for about $400, you can get a good, nice, versatile 4-wheeled rig that's easy to build on later if you need to. And I know starting out projects like this can seem complicated and intimidating, but if you follow the guide, follow the parts list, you'll be okay. And what I really like about this personally is it's so light and compact. Like if you need to pick it up and move it, you just pick it up and move it. You know, nothing to it. So anyway, I think the build was a really good success. The grinder came together really nicely. I think it's going to serve Eric really well. If you like what you saw, like, share, subscribe, all that jazz. Links to the Etsy and the Patreon and all the other social media and crap if you want to help support the channel, this, that, and the other. And y'all take care.